Marlene Whitmore had buried 5 husbands in 20 years, each death more mysterious than the last. But it wasn't until Jack Donnelly vanished that the town's whispered suspicions erupted into full-blown accusations. Everyone believed Marlene was a cold-hearted killer. But when Jack's body was found, and a forgotten name, Harriet Kramer, resurfaced, the real story unraveled, revealing a truth so twisted no one in Bellridge saw it coming. Marlene Whitmore's story began in the small, slow-moving town of Bellridge, where secrets whispered behind lace curtains and reputations were shaped over cups of sweet tea. Marlene moved there in her early 20s after marrying a man twice her age, Albert Whitmore, a wealthy retired insurance adjuster with a fondness for rare coins and quiet evenings. Their wedding was modest, and their house was a 3-bedroom cottage on Larchmont Drive, neat, tidy, and shaded by a tall, weeping willow. For a while, everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until Albert died. He was found at the bottom of the stairs, neck snapped, glass of wine spilled beside him. Police ruled it an accident, no foul play. Marlene was inconsolable. She wore black for months, rarely leaving the house. People pitied her. Albert's life insurance policy, worth a surprising $200,000, was quietly processed. She didn't flaunt it. She never even bought a new car, just stayed home, mourning. No one suspected anything. But then came Henry, a retired math teacher who volunteered at the local library, gentle, kind, and adored by everyone. He and Marlene met at the town's spring book fair and were married within the year. Henry was different, outgoing, friendly, and deeply devoted to his new wife. For a while it seemed Marlene had found peace again, but their marriage lasted only 14 months. Henry was found floating in the bathtub, face down, cause of death, drowning. No signs of forced entry or struggle. A few bruises on his arms were attributed to slipping. Again, Marlene was devastated. Again, she wore black. Again, the town whispered. But whispers are not evidence. By the time her third husband, Alan, died from a heart attack just 18 months after their wedding, the mood in Bellridge began to shift. People no longer saw Marlene as unlucky. They saw her as cursed. The fact that each husband left behind life insurance policies only added fuel to the suspicions, but nothing concrete ever surfaced. The insurance companies paid out, the police followed protocol, and Marlene, always the grieving widow, continued her quiet life behind closed doors. When her fourth husband, Charles, an amateur storm chaser, was killed by a freak lightning strike on a clear evening during a walk in the park, the townspeople were no longer whispering. They were talking, loudly. They didn't believe in coincidence anymore. Rumors spiraled. She was poisoning them, staging accidents, or perhaps involved in some dark ritual. The fact that none of the deaths could be directly tied to her only made it more frustrating. She became a local myth. Parents warned their sons to stay away. The newspaper ran veiled opinion pieces hinting at patterns too strange to ignore. Still, she was never charged. Every case had plausible explanations: accidental, natural, tragic. Even the fifth husband, Peter, whose body was discovered slumped over in his car in the garage, was ruled a suicide at first, carbon monoxide poisoning. But even that couldn't be pinned on Marlene. She claimed she had been out shopping all day. The store receipts confirmed her alibi. By now, she had become a ghost in her own neighborhood. People crossed the street to avoid her. Kids dared each other to walk past her house. Her once charming smile became a source of dread. Yet there was never enough to arrest her. 5 husbands, 5 funerals, 5 insurance payouts. All legal, all tragic. And through it all, Marlene remained calm. She never lashed out, never defended herself publicly, never tried to clear her name. She just carried on, living in the same old house, surrounded by whispers, rumors, and suspicion, until Jack Donnelly came to town. and everything started again, but this time, it wouldn't end the same way. Jack Donnelly arrived in Bellridge in the early spring, just as the dogwoods began to bloom. He was different from the kind of man the town was used to. He didn't come from old money or retirement. He wasn't looking to settle into a slow life. Jack had fire in his veins, the kind of energy that came from years of high-risk jobs and near misses. As a former firefighter turned self-employed landscaper, Jack didn't mind getting his hands dirty. He moved into a small house on the edge of town and quickly found work tending to overgrown yards and planting flower beds for the elderly. He made friends easily, especially among those who didn't quite know the history of Bellridge's most infamous widow. That changed quickly. It wasn't long before Jack crossed paths with Marlene. They met at the annual church fundraiser where she was selling homemade peach cobbler to raise money for repairs to the chapel roof. Jack bought a slice, complimented her on the taste, and offered to help her carry boxes to her car. That simple moment bloomed into a quiet relationship. At first, no one paid much attention. Marlene had been alone for a couple of years by then, and most had assumed she would never remarry. But when Jack was seen more frequently on her porch, and the two were spotted walking together on Sunday afternoons, the town buzzed. Some tried to warn him, subtle comments at the gas station, half-joking remarks at the hardware store. But Jack laughed them off. He didn't believe in small-town gossip. He believed in what he saw, and what he saw in Marlene was a woman who had suffered more than her share of loss, but who carried herself with grace. He called her strong, not suspicious. And before summer arrived, he had moved in. By July, they were married in a quiet ceremony with only a few attendees. Marlene wore black, not for mourning this time, but for elegance. The whispers grew louder. The headlines in the local blog were practically begging for a sixth tragedy. But Jack remained alive, well, and remarkably happy. Months passed with no incidents. The neighbors started to wonder if maybe they'd been wrong all along. In fact, Jack seemed to thrive. He turned their backyard into a mini paradise, complete with raised garden beds, a koi pond, and a handmade wooden swing. He laughed often, hosted weekend barbecues, and even coached Little League. Marlene appeared lighter, too. She smiled more, baked often, and was seen chatting in public again. For the first time in years, things seemed normal. Then, one cold January morning, Jack was gone. Marlene told police he left a note, that he'd packed a few things, said he needed time, space, clarity. She even had a voicemail on her phone, Jack's voice, distant but calm, repeating that he just couldn't do it anymore. He was too overwhelmed, too unsettled. The police didn't push hard. Adults left relationships all the time. No crime had been committed. The voicemail seemed legitimate, the note written in his own handwriting. Marlene said she was heartbroken, but respected his need for space. But the town didn't buy it. The hardware store clerk said Jack had been in just days earlier, buying mulch and wood for a new project. A neighbor swore she saw him carrying groceries into the house the night before his supposed departure. And the barber down on Main Street said Jack had booked an appointment for the following week. None of it lined up with someone planning to leave suddenly. Still, no body, no blood, no evidence, just an absence and a familiar trail of uncertainty. Marlene, once again, was alone, and the curse of Bellridge's most whispered-about widow was once again in full swing. But this time, something felt different. Something was off, and someone was finally ready to ask the questions no one else had dared. The woods beyond Bellridge stretched endlessly, thick with pine and silence, a forgotten place where time stood still. It was there, nearly 5 months after Jack Donnelly vanished, that his body was discovered. A group of hunters, tracking deer through dense brush and muddy terrain, stumbled upon a partially collapsed shed. Rotted wood, moss-covered roof, and beneath it, an unnatural mound of disturbed earth. Curious, one of them kicked at the pile. The soil shifted. What they saw next stopped them cold. The skeletal remains were curled, hidden beneath plastic sheeting and layers of dead leaves. Police were called immediately. The forensics team worked through the night. Dental records confirmed the truth. Jack Donnelly was dead. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. The wound was consistent with a heavy, sharp object. No defensive injuries, no signs of struggle. Whatever had happened, it had been quick and silent. The town erupted. Whispers turned into accusations, and all eyes turned back to Marlene Whitmore. Detectives returned to her home with a search warrant, this time with new urgency. They combed through every inch of the small cottage, cabinets, closets, crawl spaces, but the house was pristine. Too pristine. No trace of blood, no murder weapon, no signs of Jack ever being injured inside the home. The forensic team turned to the attic, rarely used and sealed with an old latch. What they found there cracked the case wide open. A chest, ornate, dusty, and locked with a small rusted padlock, sat behind a curtain of cobwebs. Inside, wrapped in cloth and layers of old newspaper, were objects no one expected. Dozens of photographs of Marlene and her previous husbands, some of them candid, some framed but others bizarrely altered. One had eyes scratched out, another had a lipstick smear across the mouth. Among them, handwritten notes, pressed flowers, and a small leather-bound journal. The journal didn't belong to Marlene. It belonged to Alan, her third husband, presumed dead of a heart attack over a decade ago. His entries were dated and detailed. He wrote of confusion, dizziness, and unexplained fatigue. He expressed suspicions that someone was tampering with his medication. In his final entries, he mentioned a strange taste in his tea and waking up unable to move his arms. Then, the writing abruptly stopped. Though old, the journal was damning. Investigators examined it closely, but one detail stood out: the small, smeared fingerprint on the inner page. It didn't match Marlene. It matched Jack Donnelly. That single fingerprint proved Jack had found the journal before his death, that he'd held it, read it, possibly confronted someone about it. The question was, who? Digging deeper, detectives uncovered a second anomaly: a matchbook tucked inside the chest's false bottom. It had burn marks and initials carved on the cover, HQ. That clue, cryptic and seemingly out of place, led them in a new direction. The initials didn't match any of Marlene's husbands, but they did match someone else from her past, a woman named Harriet Kramer. Harriet had been Marlene's neighbor decades ago, during her first marriage. Back then they were inseparable, best friends. Harriet worked as a veterinary technician and had access to a range of medications, some of which, if misused, could cause symptoms like the ones Alan had written about. But Harriet had disappeared 23 years earlier, shortly after Marlene's first husband's funeral. Everyone assumed she'd moved away to live with family. There were no missing persons reports, no searches. She simply vanished. With new evidence in hand, authorities began to reconsider everything. Maybe Marlene wasn't the cold-blooded killer everyone thought she was. Maybe someone else had been pulling the strings all along. Jack had found something dangerous enough to get him killed. And for the first time, investigators realized the real killer might not have been the widow everyone feared, but the friend no one remembered. The discovery of Harriet Kramer's name, etched into the forgotten corners of Marlene's attic, sent shockwaves through the investigation. Most people in Bellridge barely remembered Harriet, just a quiet woman who used to live next door and vanished after Albert Whitmore's funeral over 2 decades ago. Her name had never been linked to anything sinister. But now, with her initials found among the remains of a dead man and an old journal that hinted at foul play, everything changed. Investigators dug into Harriet's past. Before her disappearance, she had worked for 10 years at a veterinary clinic 2 towns over. Her records revealed she had access to controlled substances, some of which could easily mimic symptoms of natural death or cause rapid decline if mixed with food or drink. The same clinic where she worked had burned down mysteriously a year after she vanished. One body had been recovered from the ashes, badly burned, and presumed to be hers, but no DNA testing had been done at the time. The coroner had relied on a bracelet found near the body, a bracelet Harriet was known to wear. With modern forensic tools now available, the case was reopened. The remains from the clinic fire were quietly exhumed and tested. The results were staggering. The bones didn't belong to Harriet. They belonged to an unidentified male. Harriet Kramer had faked her death. Now every death tied to Marlene was under new scrutiny. The similarities, strange symptoms, sudden collapses, no forced entry, no longer pointed to just one suspect. The possibility that Harriet had orchestrated these deaths, working in the shadows while the town condemned Marlene, became more plausible with each new piece of evidence. Marlene herself was brought in for questioning again. This time investigators treated her not as a suspect, but as a potential pawn. She admitted to keeping the chest in the attic, saying it was filled with mementos too painful to throw away. She claimed she never opened the journal and didn't know how Jack had found it. Her voice trembled as she described the fear that had quietly grown inside her over the years, a fear she'd never dared to speak aloud. She said Harriet had always been intense, overly protective, even jealous of her marriages. When Albert died, Harriet changed. Then she disappeared. Marlene thought she had left for good. She never imagined Harriet might have stayed, hidden, watching. Theories formed quickly. Harriet, grieving her own losses or twisted by obsession, could have been eliminating the men in Marlene's life out of spite or sick devotion. Perhaps she believed she was protecting Marlene from betrayal, or perhaps she simply couldn't bear to see her with anyone else. She had the knowledge, the means, and, most frightening of all, the time. 2 decades of time to stalk, to plan, and to kill without ever being seen. Authorities canvassed Bellridge and its surrounding areas. They visited abandoned cabins, hospitals, and shelters, looking for any sign of a woman in her late 60s who might be hiding in plain sight. A few leads came in, but none conclusive. Then, during a routine review of surveillance footage from a gas station near the state highway, they found something chilling. The footage showed a woman wearing a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat in the middle of summer. Her face was obscured, but her posture was stiff, her walk deliberate. She paid in cash, bought 2 cans of gasoline, and wore gloves despite the sweltering heat. A closer look revealed a patch sewn onto her jacket. HKK. Vet Clinic. It was a name long forgotten, a place long burned, a woman long presumed dead. That footage changed everything. It wasn't just a theory anymore. Harriet Kramer was alive. And someone else, someone who had lived in the shadows for decades, was finally being seen. The truth about Marlene's past and the deaths that had haunted her life had never belonged to her alone. The real darkness had always been behind her, silent, waiting. With the discovery of the gas station footage, the pieces of the puzzle finally began falling into place. The woman in the video, hidden beneath oversized clothing and dark sunglasses, matched no one currently known to be living in Bellridge. But her movements, the patch on her jacket, and the timestamp so closely aligned with Jack Donnelly's disappearance that investigators were certain they had found Harriet Kramer. She had resurfaced after decades underground, and her mistake, appearing on a security camera in broad daylight, had finally pulled her back into the light. Law enforcement traced the purchase to a secluded property on the outskirts of town, registered to a fake name but paid for in cash year after year. It was a crumbling 2-room cabin, nestled between thick trees and nearly inaccessible by road. Inside, the space was sparse and musty, but a single room told a darker story. Along the walls were pinned newspaper clippings, each one detailing the deaths of Marlene's husbands. In the center of the room stood a corkboard marked with strings and notes, all leading back to one name: Marlene Whitmore. There were photos, too, some taken from a distance, others clearly captured with a telephoto lens. Marlene walking alone, Marlene at her mailbox, Marlene sitting by a window. Harriet hadn't just been hiding, she'd been watching. Investigators found more inside. A burner phone containing a single voicemail draft, never sent but saved. The voice was digitally disguised, but there was one fatal mistake. She used a phrase, "Sugar Papa," a name Harriet had once used for Marlene's first husband in front of neighbors. It was a term no one else in Bellridge used. The audio matched nothing in Marlene's voice patterns. The text traced the phone's last pings to within a mile of the forest where Jack Donnelly had been buried. The realization hit hard. Jack had found Harriet. Or, at the very least, he had found something that pointed to her. Investigators believed he had confronted her, possibly to protect Marlene or expose the truth, and for that, he had been silenced. The case took a dramatic turn as law enforcement officially exonerated Marlene Whitmore. For years, the entire town had treated her like a murderer, a cursed woman who couldn't keep a husband alive. In reality, she had been surrounded by death, orchestrated by someone hiding in the shadows, someone she once called a friend. The town struggled to process it. People who had once avoided Marlene now left flowers on her porch. The church, once hesitant to let her sit in the front pews, issued a formal apology. Yet Marlene didn't celebrate. She kept her head down, grief etched deeper than ever in her features. She had lost not only 5 husbands, but also years of her life to fear, isolation, and public suspicion. Harriet Kramer was never found. Despite nationwide alerts, age progression sketches, and a media storm, she vanished again, just like she had the first time. Some believed she fled across the border. Others thought she died in the woods near Bellridge, her body still hidden beneath layers of earth and brush. But a few, including Marlene herself, believed Harriet was still alive, watching, somewhere out there. The case was closed, but never fully resolved. No charges could be filed without a body. No justice could be served without a trial. Marlene moved away a few months later, settling in a quieter town under a new name, trying to start over in a life untouched by tragedy. But for many in Bellridge, the legend remained. The woman accused of killing 5 husbands had never committed a single crime. And the woman who had haunted her life with precision, patience, and poison had slipped through their fingers once again. It only took one mistake to uncover the truth, but sometimes one truth isn't enough to bury the past.